really happy to be here. I want to say, it's both a pleasure. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, okay. Now you can hear me, right? It's both a pleasure and an honor to be here. The older I get, the clearer it is to me that this life is very short, right? Very, very short. And you know what? Eternity is like really, really, really long, right? And so, everything we do here, now, has to be ordered to that, right? It'd be stupid to do anything else. This is so short, and that is so long. And I know you know that too. And that's the motivation for everything you do and for this conference. So that's why it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And that actually provides the right context for my topic, which is the role of stories in good education. The role of stories is invaluable. It's not the only or even the most perfect kind of education. It's not the most perfect way to teach, but it is preparatory, important, and natural, which is huge. It's no accident that Jesus taught using parables, or that the Old Testament consists largely of stories, true stories, but stories about our fathers in faith. Men learn from stories, especially the young, and they are thus prepared to learn principles. So when Andrew said last night that, there's always this connection between the story and the law, I thought, that's what we're talking about. It's through the story that you're prepared to learn the principle, which is what you get in the law. A significant advantage, too, of the story is that the reader can achieve the knowledge that he gains without the painful and destructive consequences that often come from lived experience, right? I know we're all familiar with Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I often wish that all young women, actually all young people, would read that book. Both Marianne and Eleanor have to deal with betrayal by someone they love. Marianne does it emotionally and self-centeredly and nearly destroys herself in the process. Eleanor, on the other hand, struggles against self-absorption, learns to subject her passions to reason, and works on a charitable outlook of all concerned. She's a much happier woman, and all those around her are happier too. The effect of the book is to make the reader see that Eleanor is right, and to wish that Marianne would learn from her, which she does eventually. Jane Austen does admirably what St. Thomas says is the poet's task, to lead us to something virtuous by some fitting representation. In a recent article, American Civilization Has Lost Its Way, God bless you, Michael Novak said this: "We normally encounter morals through the language of moral codes and commandments. Do this, don't do that. But it is much more illuminating to approach ethics and morals through stories and narratives. The reason narrative is more helpful than a code or set of commandments is that it brings into play imagination, manner, style, and even tonal quality. For example, the commandment says, 'Honor thy father and thy mother.' But the commandment does not tell us in what manner, with what tone of voice, with what degree of gentleness and or firmness, or whether with renewed devotion or simply by routine. Sometimes, to do the right thing in the wrong way or in the wrong manner is to spoil it. Perhaps that is why Jesus so often chose to talk in stories rather than in blunt commands. He wanted to teach about the manner and style of actions, not only their substance, to be gentle, to be kind, to be forgiving, to temper your treatment of the weak reeds. All of these were essential to his message. To act as a Christian is not only to perform certain abstract duties to the letter of the law, but also to live according to the spirit and temper of the law. In some ways, it is more illuminating to speak of imitating Christ than of merely obeying him, We are all skillful at the little child's trick of performing exactly what the parent tells her, while at the same time mocking the task. So, I thought that's pretty good. I mean, Michael Novak, that was good. Through the story, then, the reader takes on the actions of the characters he is reading about, particularly the protagonist, as performed by an individual, not as a universal proposition. One knows, right, that one's emotions should be ordered by right reason. We all know that. But in watching the concrete instance of Eleanor dealing with her difficulties, one sees what that actually looks like and even feels what it feels like. Through the privilege of the reader, who can participate in the life of more than one character, one also sees and feels what it is like to let the emotions rule the reason, as Marianne does. Because of this, stories often move the heart toward the good in a way the direct teaching of the truth, especially initially and especially in the young, does not. Since these truths are encountered in a concrete, incarnational format that engages both the mind and heart, there's less inclination to reject the teaching. The reader is participating in the journey and learning with the characters. So he's learning the lessons that life teaches, and he's learning them in a non-confrontational mode. In many people, there's a resistance to just being told what to do. Even if one does what one is told, the act of obedience is not then the act of the whole person, as Dr. Novak pointed out. So when I'm talking to the moms I consult with in my program, I always remind them that, hey look, obedience is no good unless you have their hearts. Stories capture the hearts of children. Dr. Andrew Seeley, sitting right there, in a recent article on his website, explained that reading The Lord of the Rings when he was young captured his heart and excited his imagination. It inspired a longing for great deeds beyond the ordinary, comfortable, stable, and safe life. He explained that longing for an imagined ideal prepared him to embrace Catholicism as the highest and most real kind of romance, which is the truth, right? Living the story presented by Tolkien in the way that one lives the story not only captured his heart, but molded it, showing him and moving him toward a moral universe that he had just not encountered in the secular culture in which he lived. He said that on his website, by the way. Okay. So, why is this? What is it about stories that make them achieve these important ends for our students? Right? It's one thing to know that something is the case, but you don't really know it unless you know why it is. So you always ask that question next. Why? Why do stories work that way? And then, what's the best way to take advantage of that for those of us who are teaching our students? The first thing that reading a story well does is enlarge his experience. In the book, An Experiment in Criticism, C.S. Lewis says this: the primary impulse of each is to maintain and aggrandize himself. The secondary impulse is to go out of the self, to correct its provincialism and heal its loneliness. In love, in virtue, in the pursuit of knowledge, and in the reception of the arts, we are doing this. Obviously, this process can be described either as enlargement or as a temporary annihilation of the self. But that is an old paradox. He that loses his life shall save it. Oh, that's beautiful. Lewis expands a bit. He says, we become these other selves, not only nor chiefly in order to see what they are like, but in order to see what they see. To occupy for a while their seat in the great theater, to use their spectacles and be made free of whatever insights, joys, terrors, wonders, or merriment those spectacles reveal. This, so far as I can see, is the specific value or good of literature considered as logos. It admits us to experiences other than our own. This is a huge benefit that comes from reading stories. There's more to be said because not every experience is worth having. And similarly, not every book is worth reading. But to use the words of C.S. Lewis once again, he says, those of us, which is most of you, who have been true readers all our life, seldom fully realize the enormous extension of our being which we owe to authors. We realize it best when we talk with an unliterary friend. He may be full of goodness and good sense, but he inhabits a tiny world. My own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through the eyes of others. At that point in this text, C.S. Lewis says something else that I think is worth meditating on. He says, literary experience heals the wound without undermining the privilege of individuality. Isn't that interesting? So you see it immediately say, what does that mean? The wound he is talking of, I think, is loneliness, because he said that earlier. The individual is alone and he is incomplete. He needs others to complete his being. So Lewis goes on. There are mass emotions that heal the wound. That is, they give us the experiences of other beings, but they destroy the privilege. In them, our separate selves are pooled, and we sink back into sub-individuality. What it reminded me of was the Arabian Aristotelians, you know, the idea that at the end of mortal life, all men will be joined into one great consciousness, that kind of thing. But, Lewis says, in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men, and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself, and I am never more myself than when I do. In reading a good story, you see as others see. You understand what you would not on your own, but you do that by enlarging your individual understanding, not by submerging it. And the story does this by teaching, not didactically, but nonetheless truly. And through the story, my mind and will are led to the truth. No teacher learns for his student, right? You can't learn from your students. All you can do for them is lay out the truth in the right order so that the student's own mind can be led step by step to see that truth. And he sees it by the light of his own mind, because that's the only way he can see it. That's what a good story does too. It does so through individual concrete experiences in which the reader participates vicariously, rather than through universally true propositions leading to a conclusion. But it's essential to see that in a good story, the individual experiences are embodiments or incarnations of universal truth. The way that the author represents the objects leads the reader to regard them in a good story in a true light. You know, if you're wondering, how do I tell this? I went with my son, James, to a conference he was speaking at in Amsterdam. And it was a liberal studies conference, you know, colleges. The one thing they were all agreed on was that there's no truth and you can't know anything. And the burning question was, how do you tell what you should include in your schools? Right? I mean, obviously, how would you know, right? So, and James was the only person in that entire conference who had anything profitable to say to that. But they didn't like it. But anyway. But in a good story, right? In a good story, what the reader is led to is to regard the things he is participating in the right light, in a true light. The imitator has an advantage over nature. He can bring out and make evident what, in the nature of things, is inward and hidden. He can make things look like what they are. So the heroine of the story can be beautiful and kind, and the hero can be brave and handsome. Their outward appearance matches their inward character. Of course, this does not give knowledge, formation of one's mind and character, because disposition comes before habit, and discovery comes before judgment. Good stories give the reader experience and show him in an incarnational way what virtue is and what it looks like. And that was Dr. Seeley's point, Andrew. So his experience and understanding of reality is extended, enriched, and guided. Now, you know, all the arts do that in some respect. When you look at a great painting, I love Thomas Moran paintings. And he paints Southwest, and he always, you know, light is a big part of his pictures. When I look at his painting, I see something I wouldn't see myself, even if I were looking at the same scene. He guides my very sight to see something that's actually there, but that I wouldn't notice. But having him point out the importance of the contrast between dark and light in appreciating those natural features, then I notice it when I look at a landscape, and I notice it in other paintings. He guides my understanding. And that's what a good story does. A long time ago, right, Aristotle defined a good story. He said that it's an imitation of action and life. It's the poetics. And an imitation of the agent of the action for the sake of that action. He also pointed out that the storyteller is not a historian. His work is more noble, because it is more philosophic and more universal. It teaches universal truth. So that's really important, right? I mean, actually, the literature classes are the most philosophic, except when you're doing philosophy. They're the most philosophic of the courses that you do. You know, he says, Aristotle says, the storyteller's work is more noble because it's more philosophic and more universal. It teaches universal truth. And to do that requires, he says, that the truth be presented as a whole. The story as a unit, with a beginning, middle, and end, has to be presented intact. Now, the historian differs from the poet by speaking of what has actually occurred, whereas the poet speaks of the kinds of things that are likely to occur. In view of this, poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history. For poetry speaks rather of what is universally the case, even if it's concretized in a particular incarnation, whereas history speaks of universal events that actually occurred. If you want to go look at that yourself, it's in the Poetics about 1451, B 1 to 10, so if you'd like to look, check it out. History is particular, literature is universal. Chesterton says it another way. He says, a good poet or storyteller is able to give his readers a glorious glimpse into the possibilities of existence. But those possibilities have to be possibilities. That is, they must be consistent with reality. So he also says, if you draw a giraffe, you must draw him with a long neck. If, in your bold, creative way, you hold yourself free to draw him with a short neck, you will find you are not free to draw a giraffe. The universal truths with which the storyteller concerns himself have to do most of all with the moral order. Since stories are about human actions, and human actions are either good or bad, the stories are going to have to portray the character's actions in such a context. So in A Landscape with Dragons, Michael O'Brien says, the sun may be green, and the fish may fly through the air, but however fantastical the imagined world, there is retained in it a faithfulness to the moral order of our universe. The stories that we read to our children need to reflect a true moral order, because it is that about which it is teaching in the way the stories teach. Now, some might and have objected that the wicked prosper in this world, or that everyone is a mixture of good and bad, and so a good story should take these things into account. That's true enough. But a story, which is not a history, must mirror the ultimate reality, not the short-term, short-sighted inversion of the moral order. People may be a mixture of good and bad, but the bad has to be seen as bad, which in a story means that the consequences of bad actions have to be shown in an intelligible manner. So stories where lying is glorified, which it is in much modern literature, or stories where that use symbols that have always been taken to indicate evil are now used to indicate good. That's a problem. That's a serious problem. Philosophy starts with common experience and a reflection on that experience. Stories provide the right experiences, morally ordered experiences, for one to reflect on fruitfully. That is what reading a good story well does for you. It expands your experience safely, shows in concrete, particular characters and actions what good universal principles look like encountered in life, and prepares the mind and heart for the encountering of those same principles in a universal form. It engages the reader's mind and heart and moves him toward the truth. Now, here's, in my opinion, the philosophical underpinning to this, which is what I'm always most interested in. Stories are natural to man because of his composite nature. We're made of body and soul. So we participate in both the material and the immaterial, the concrete and the universal. His intellectual knowledge, our intellectual knowledge, arrives from sensation and continues to depend on it. All of our learning starts in sensible experience. And we learn what we learn, little by little, knowing things in a sort of confusion before we know them distinctly. So the things that are harder to know and that are more worth knowing, things more distant from the immediately sensible, have to be grasped by a likeness before they can be grasped in themselves. Which is why Jesus uses parables, because he's teaching us universal truths in that way. And I know there are some things you know right away from the beginning, like that the whole's greater than the part, or that, things can't both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. That as soon as you have any encounter with being, you know. But things like justice and beauty, right and wrong, sacrifice and greed, that's going to depend on what the student encounters in his environment, which includes what he reads. He has to have experiences of these immaterial qualities in order to come to understand them. And some such experiences come from his day-to-day life. But reading good stories adds significantly to that experience. And as I said earlier, good stories help the reader see in a guided way, since the story actually highlights the important concepts so as to direct the reader's attention to them. I've spoken about this before, but I do honestly think that a knowledge of how one comes to understand is important. It's probably the most important thing I do in my trainings for my students, for my teachers. Sorry, I do it with students too, but my teachers. In every training, I go over the doctrine of the de anima. And I know that some of you know it better than I do, and some of you know it because you've heard this before. But just in case you haven't heard this before, I want to tell you, because I really think this is important for you as teachers. And, there's a lot more that can be said. You can read the de anima on my website, under curriculum, under methodology. I have a fuller explanation. But just for here and now, let me say this. Everything we learn starts in sensible experience. What we receive through our proper senses. We see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, hear it. One of those. And then the forms that we receive through the proper senses are passed on to what Aristotle called the common sense, which is where that information is, where the forms, right, are integrated. So, your eyes see the thing on the table is white, and your tongue can tell that it's sweet. But your eyes can't tell that it's sweet, and your tongue can't tell that it's white. But you know that it's the same thing, that is both sweet and white. There's a place in you where the information that you get from your sensible experience is integrated. And Aristotle calls that the common sense. Then that's moved, passed on, supposed by nerves, to what he calls the imagination, we think of as the brain. And in the imagination, those images are received like a seal pressing into wax. And then they're sorted into like kinds. So all the trees go in one section, and all the tables go in one section, right? By a power he calls the vis cogitativa. And then, this is the cool part, those like things in the imagination, because everything up to this point is, right, you're talking about the body is involved. But this is the point where the immaterial power of the soul, the agent intellect, acts on those like forms in the imagination and draws out of them what is common, what's universal, the essence of the thing. And then that is impressed, in a manner of speaking, into the possible intellect. It's received in the possible intellect, and that's how you know. And that's how we all know. It's how we know anything we know. That's the process by which you go. Which is why in my program we spend so much time, and actually why you do too, working on developing the power, strength, docility of the imagination. Because clearly the quality of the images in the imagination is going to make a difference in how well the child thinks. So it's important to work on the strength and docility of the imagination. But this is also the reason why stories are so natural. We receive those images from the stories we read, and they're in the imagination to be utilized, well, acted on by the agent intellect. It's to this reality that Plato directs himself in the Republic when he tells us that if the soul has in it good, true, beautiful, noble, and heroic images, it will become like those things. He's not kidding, you know? I mean, this is really cool. When that essence, that universal, is impressed into the possible intellect, received in the possible intellect, then you actually have that form in your soul. It's really true that like is only known by like, and that you have to become the thing in order to know it. You don't become it the way it is in the material world, but you actually do become it. You're united with that universal, which is absolutely amazing when you think about, so we know trees, but we also know angels, and we know God, we know Jesus. There's a very real sense in which you're actually united with the thing that you know, which is amazing. So those images in the imagination are always, even when they're about the natural world, they're signs of a noble and in fact a divine reality, because the world is created by God and reflects him. And they do, not by themselves, of course, but nonetheless truly, help to bring about that reality in the soul of the student. So one speaks of a sacramental imagination, one that provides signs pointing to divine reality and participating in bringing that about in the soul. So a story teaches, but it teaches as experience teaches, concretely. A story is a whole with a beginning, middle, and end. You don't grasp the story until you have the whole. So the intellectual truth to be gained is apparent only after the whole experience and by reflection on it. Chapters of a novel or the acts of a play are often relatively meaningless when wrenched from the whole. I was just at Michael Gerlander's talk about using Dante to teach moral theology, and he said it's really important that you don't just read the Inferno, right? Because it's only a part. And if you don't have the whole, you don't know what's going on. Certainly, any judgments you're going to make about the parts or the characters as one is going through the story will have to be re-examined when the story is complete. I was recently talking to a friend who just finished Christian Lavren's daughter, and he said his opinion of the characters just kept changing all the way through the story. It wasn't until the end that he could actually make a judgment about those characters. Further, you will not grasp the story unless you live the story, which is what Andrew was saying. Because of its nature, two of the most important aspects of reading a story are thus lack of interruption and total immersion. The two aspects go together. If the story is interrupted, the reader can't be immersed in it. Since the story read effectively must move us, we have to let it work on us. We must make ourselves open to it. It's not possible to do that when you are constantly moving in and out of the story, to discuss, analyze, or prepare for upcoming chapters. That encourages a kind of skepticism. For this reason, Mortimer Adler's first piece of advice for reading stories in his book, How to Read a Book, and it's mine as well from personal experience, is to read the story quickly and with total immersion. He says the ideal is to read a literary work in one sitting, but since that is not always possible, the ideal should be approximated by compressing the reading of a good story into as short a time as is feasible. Otherwise, you will forget what happened. The unity of the plot will escape you, and you will be lost. He also says, and this resonates with me, the tremendous pleasure that can come from reading Shakespeare, for instance, was spoiled for generations of high school students who were forced to go through Julius Caesar, As You Like It, or Hamlet, scene by scene, looking up all the strange words in a glossary and studying all the scholarly footnotes. As a result, they have never really read a Shakespearean play. By the time they reached the end, they had forgotten the beginning and lost sight of the whole. There's a place for a more in-depth study of a story, but it comes after the story has been seen as a story, a whole, and has, so to speak, been lived. Also, it comes when the student is ready to analyze. Then one moves to the next level because he's ready to fruitfully analyze, categorize, and criticize. C.S. Lewis, again, in An Experiment in Criticism, agrees. He says, the necessary condition of all good reading is to get ourselves out of the way. We do not help the young to do this by forcing them to keep on expressing opinions. Lewis further points out that direct contact between the mind of the author and this, I feel strongly about this, and the mind of the student should precede any commentary by another person. He notes, everyone who sees the work of honors students in English at a university has noticed with distress their increasing tendency to see books wholly through the spectacles of other books. The all-important conjunction, reader meets text, never seems to have been allowed to occur of itself and develop spontaneously. Lewis maintains that critical reading, that is, reading about books in other books, should only happen after one has read the original itself. Scholarly notes should not be used in a first reading. And I thought it was really interesting, again, in Michael's workshop. He was saying that when he was first teaching Dante, he used an edition that had, well, not the first time, but maybe the second time. He used an edition that had a bunch of notes at the beginning, so explaining it to the kids. So they weren't just reading the text, they're reading somebody else's idea of the text. And he said he found that just didn't work as well. Of course it doesn't work as well. You've got to let the student actually read that story. You know, those things are great because they're great, because they move generations of people. You don't need somebody else telling you what to think about that story. Okay, I anticipate some objections. I can imagine some of you thinking, but the students will miss so much. Or, Shakespeare is impossible to read without a gloss. As to the first, my response is, have confidence in the mind of the student. He's learned a lot already in his life, much of it from context. Stories really are more experience, and one learns from them profitably in the same way. It is so much better for a student to gather the meaning of a word from its context than to stop and go find a dictionary. In the first place, stopping interrupts the flow of the story. And in the second place, it doesn't encourage in the student the valuable habit of learning from context, which he will need as he progresses scholastically. Similarly, stopping a story to go to another source to explain the plot or the character panders to our cultural desire for immediate results and inhibits wonder. It's really good for the students to be reading and thinking, what's going on? How is this going to work out? What is that relationship anyway? They exercise wonder. They learn to wait for results. They draw inferences, and they develop the habits for all of those things. Also, don't expect that the student is never going to read this work again. The reason Michael, I'm sorry to do this, but it brought so many things to me. And the reason Michael decided to do the Dante for his students was because he had read it at a similar stage of his life, and it had affected him. And now, I'm sure he's read it in between, but he's certainly read it a lot in the last, whatever years. That's what you should expect. One should be willing to and expect to read and reread a truly good book. We don't have to and shouldn't try to get everything the first time around. C.S. Lewis says, the sure mark of an unliterary man is that he considers, I read it already, to be a conclusive argument against reading a work. Those who read great works will read the same work 10, 20, or 30 times during the course of their life. And I'm sure that's true. I mean, in your own experiences, right? I've read all those Jane Austen books many, 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 many times. And for years, I read The Lord of the Rings once a year. Haven't done that so much lately, but, and those are not the greatest of all works, but the things you love, that you were totally immersed in, that you lived in that world, you will go back to. With respect to the problem of reading Shakespeare or other difficult texts without a gloss, it is the case that sometimes a word is so foreign that even context is not going to help. Because Shakespeare is writing plays, and plays are meant to be performed, it's best with such a work to see it performed, or if one is going to read it aloud. That's a great help in figuring out what's going on. But I agree that there's a place for judicious explanation. Some students need more help than others, and everyone should get the help he needs. I myself have made use of retellings, high-quality literature in its own right, retellings of Shakespeare, such as Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, and also similarly good retellings of Homer, such as the Children's Homer. But I wouldn't use them if they weren't literature in their own right, and I use them as preparation, either proximate or remote, for the real thing. Further, they should also be read without interruption and with total immersion. This brings me to another point, however. I think that the discussion that's appropriate to young students as they read the good stories that we give them should be student-led. It is always better for the student's own mind to work on the matter first. When he has tried and has a question, that's the time for him to get an answer. When we anticipate what his questions are going to be and anticipate the answers for that, we often usurp the activity of his own mind. So say that you have a reading time in your classroom. Maybe you have offered a variety of books to the students from different genres and at different reading levels. Everybody is reading, but they're not all reading the same thing. But a number of people will be reading the same thing. Someone reading a Shakespeare play or a Jane Austen novel or one of the myths or something from Pédre-Calme has a question. He asks you, the teacher. You make a judgment. Is it something that he needs to know now in order to move forward in the story? Is it something that if he continues to read, he will figure out? Or is it a question that would be of value to the entire group of students reading that story? If it's the first, you just answer the question. If it's the second, you ask him to keep reading, but to come back to you if it doesn't make sense after a while. If it's the third situation, you ask him to write it down to discuss with his group at the appropriate juncture. With a short work, this is my opinion, right? But that discussion ought to be delayed until the end of the story, for the reasons we've discussed. For a longer work, if one thinks discussion during the reading of the story is merited, though that can be questionable also for the reasons given, but is sometimes desirable, then the discussion should be, first, student-led, that is, consist of the questions that the students actually ask themselves. Second, it should center on what's happened. The plot is the soul of the story, right? And what people think of the characters at this point, recognizing that because we haven't finished it yet, that we don't know them yet very well, and so not drawing any firm conclusions. And third, the discussion should encourage inference and wonder. So, what do you think is going to happen next is always a great question, because it's the question you naturally ask yourself as you're going through the story. Or did Frodo make a good decision here? Neither of those questions requires a judgment on the work or the plot or the character as a whole. C.S. Lewis goes so far as to say that since the wrong kind of activity when reading impedes reception, he's inclined to think criticism as such should be avoided altogether by boys and girls. A schoolboy's reaction to his reading is most naturally expressed by parody or imitation. So, writing a similar story is an excellent activity for young students as they integrate the truth learned from the story. For the very young, retelling performs the same function. My own experience suggests that high school is the place for real analysis. Mr. Adler's book, How to Read a Book, talks about the various levels of reading, and his determination fits with my experience. You know, I've been teaching now for a long time. If you count teaching my own children, which I do, I've been teaching for nearly 40 years. So, this is my experience. There is elementary reading, which is learning how to read, inspectional reading, where one learns how to intelligently skim a book to get an idea of the whole, analytic reading, which obviously involves analysis, and finally syntactical reading, reading a number of books in order to find out what each has to say about a given subject of interest to the investigator. Elementary reading, contrary to much modern educational pedagogy, involves kindergarten through 8th grade. Within elementary reading, there is first reading readiness, which involves physical, intellectual, language, and personal readiness. This is common to preschool and kindergarten. The second stage is when children are reading at the easy readers level, usually 1st grade. The third stage is fluency, which is often completed by 4th grade. And then mature reading, which is hopefully achieved with some degree of perfection by 8th graders. And all of that is still, in various ways, just learning how to be a good reader. It is in high school that one, in a good school, encounters inspectional and analytic reading, and syntactical reading is appropriate to college. This is Mr. Adler's, how he lays it out. He says he knows it's true that in the present day, people are often working on fluency and mature elementary reading through high school. And such a reading instruction is even offered remedially in college, but not in our classical schools, right? Our children actually are prepared to think in various ways, and they are ready, usually, to think analytically about their books. We lead them intentionally and carefully to that point. But that means letting stories be stories in the early years. In Mr. Adler's model, analytical reading is broken down into 15 rules. If you're interested, you can look at the book, which is really interesting. But even more interesting, those rules come from 4 basic questions that he says constitute the whole obligation of a reader. These questions are, first, what is the book about as a whole? Second, what is being said in detail and how? In other words, what's the argument? Third, is the book true, in whole or in part? And 4, what of it? His book is primarily about that analytic reading of expository work, but does discuss reading literature as well. And so I thought I would, to close here, share how the 4 questions can be utilized in the analytic discussions that you have with your students. For imaginative literature, he says, the structural questions, that is, what is it about as a whole, are translated into what kind of work is it? Lyric, novel, play. What is the unity of the whole work? For the story, that means what is the plot? Ask how the whole is constructed of its parts. That is, what are the steps that develop the plot, the beginning, the middle, and the end? The interpretive questions, which is how the whole is constructed in detail, involve looking at the elements of fiction, episodes and incidents, the characters and their thoughts, speeches, feelings, and actions. Look for the total scene or background or world that connects the characters. Become at home in that world. Follow the adventures of the characters on this world. Once one is clear about how the whole is constructed, he goes on to ask the critical questions. In literature, the question, is it true, requires thinking about whether there is verisimilitude. and how that is achieved. Are the good characters truly presented as good, and the bad characters regarded as bad? It also requires one to say he fully appreciates the experience provided by the author. So one's not questioning the world that's been created, but rather what's done with it. And there's a way in which there is no answer to the what of it question applied to literature. A practical book is intended to move you to action. A theoretical book is an end in itself. It enlarges your understanding and you rest in that. Literature performs according to its nature, that is, does what it's designed to do well, when it gathers you into its world, moving your mind and your heart to encounter the concretized truth of God's created reality, revealed to you by the expert eye of the author. Thank you.